Hello. So for the past few weeks, we have been reading through some feminist literature in order to gain greater insight into feminist theory and concepts. I believe it is essential to understand your opposition, or at least be aware of their positions and underlying beliefs if you want to effectively counter them. The books we've chosen aren't necessarily blockbuster record-smashing trendsetters. You've probably never even heard of their names before compared to something like The Feminine Mystique or The Female Eunuch, but maybe we can eventually get to all those as well at some point. So today we will be reviewing Masculinities by Connell. The book expands on the feminist conception of masculinity as an idea and the concept of hegemonic masculinity, a term you may have heard of before, which has been a hot topic in recent, so perhaps it's a good idea to see what's actually going on under the hood. So let's get on with it. Masculinities by Connell sets out to tackle with the difficult task of defining the elusive and abstract concept of masculinity, and I have to say it fails miserably. Even before the book has defined what masculinity is, it's already attributing certain activities and certain disciplines as masculine. For example, Western science is apparently culturally masculinized according to her words. But the appeal of science plunges us in circularity, for it has been shown in convincing detail that natural science itself has a gendered character. Western science and technology are culturally masculinized. If we point to every single ridiculous thing said in the book, we could be going for literal hours. So it's better to get to the main points where she elaborates the core concepts of the book. Now, she doesn't actually get to defining what masculinity is until quite far into the book, but some red flags become apparent. Sigmund Freud is credited as the originator of developing the core concepts of this book. It was Freud, more than anyone else, who let the cat out of the bag. He disrupted the apparently natural object, masculinity, and made an inquiry into its compositions, both possible, in essence, necessary. And as I've learned over time, once Freud is mentioned, it's mostly downhill from there. And downhill it does go. Masculinity is defined in an extremely strange manner, not as a certain set of behavioral characteristics, but rather as something different entirely. Here, masculinity is not an empirical fact, as in classical psychoanalysis, still less an eternal archetype, as in Jung. It is rather the occupant of a place in symbolic and social relations. Oedipal repressions creates a system of symbolic order in which the possessor of the phallus, a symbol to be clearly distinguished from any empirical penis, is central. Treating gender as a system of symbolic relationships, not fixed facts about a person's, makes acceptance of the phallic position a highly political act. It is always possible to refuse it, though the consequences of refusal are drastic. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari explored the rejection of the Oedipal structuring of desire in this obscure but influential anti-Oedipus. This provided the basis for Guy Hoekingham's dramatic reading of homosexuality for men as the rejection of phallic sexuality and Oedipal repression. She does go on to define it in a more concise manner even further into the book. Masculinity, to the extent that the term can be briefly defined, if at all, is simultaneously a place in gender relations, the practices through which men and women engage that place in gender, and the effects of these practices in bodily experience, personality, and culture. From these two prior quotes, it seems that according to Connell, masculinity is not an empirical fact, biological or otherwise, but rather a symbolic position in the social relations. A way to visualize this, I found, would be to imagine that social relations have two opposite poles, one of which is masculinity and the other is femininity. However, masculinity is always seen as more authoritative and important compared to femininity, which is more defined by its lack of masculinity rather than being on equal footing. Strangely, this seems to be echoing Freud's concept of penis envy. In the semiotic opposition of masculinity and femininity, masculinity is the unmarked term, the place of symbolic authority. The phallus is the master signifier, and femininity is symbolically defined by lack. But this so-called analysis is simply making bare assertions and imposing one's own extremely subjective interpretations of reality through a convoluted ideological lens as fact. In truth, it fails at defining masculinity as a useful idea, or even to place it in the context of a material world and show its historical developmental process. Her concept of masculinity also has no useful predictive power whatsoever. Connell spends quite a few words dismissing the complementarians of the past and the neo-Jungians of the present who take a view to masculinity and femininity as being complementary and essential opposites. However, she's in no way better and in many ways probably worse than those who she decries. If all of this so far sounds profoundly confusing and incoherent, then that's because it is. Masculinities by R.W. Connell signifies the post-structural turn that academic feminism and much of social science took after the 90s. I'm not exactly sure how fruitful it would be to even try to deconstruct everything, so I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. There's plenty of nonsense in the book, but I would like to skip most of it and move on to the concept of hegemonic masculinity, which is one of the concepts that did manage to trickle down from academia to general discourse at least to some degree. Hegemonic masculinity is defined as such. At any given time, one form of masculinity rather than others is culturally exalted. Hegemonic masculinity can be defined as the configuration of gender practice which embodies the currently accepted answer to the problem of the legitimacy of patriarchy, which guarantees or is taken to guarantee the dominant position of men and the subordination of women. So, if that sounded confusing, let me explain. Whatever form of ideal is promoted in society becomes hegemonic masculinity by virtue of it being promoted in society. Strip away the postmodern lingo and it becomes evidently clear that this is nothing but a completely tautological statement mixed with a bare assertion at the end, which is that no matter what ideals are exalted in society, women will be subordinated with nothing to substantiate such a broad sweeping claim. And the theory gets even more bizarre with the following statement. This is not to say that most visible bearers of hegemonic masculinity are always the most powerful people. They may be exemplars such as film actors, or even fantasy figures such as film characters. Individual holders of institutional power or great power or wealth may be far from the hegemonic pattern in their personal lives. So, even fictional characters can be carriers of hegemonic masculinity, according to Connell. Never mind the fact that what is idealized in fiction, even by women themselves, if we take, for example, the female-oriented fiction like 50 Shades of Grey or 365 Days, such behavior is most often not even accepted in the real world. This is a bizarre statement completely divorced from reality made by Connell. Obviously, hegemonic masculinity is but only one form of masculinity according to the writer. If at any given time one form of masculinity is exalted over all others, then what of these other alternative forms of masculinity? where no real she classifies these as protest masculinity. Forms of masculinity where no real institutional power exists, but merely empty posturing. But this too, again, is merely tautological and circular reasoning. Whatever is idealized is hegemonic, whatever is at the margins is protest. Due to the circular nature of the theory, it is very much unfalsifiable. Obviously, there is a lot of other topics discussed in the book, but I really don't feel as though there's much to be gained from discussing the minor details. Rather, it's better to move on to the larger conclusions. Masculinities by Connell encapsulates post-90s feminist theory and a feminist retreat to academia. The postmodern jargon-filled language and reference-heavy writing very much suggest academics writing for academics, rather than the general public and the mainstream popularity, which might explain the length of time it took for some of these concepts to trickle down to the masses and the general lack of clear understanding among the people about these concepts as well. However, after looking directly at the source, it's clear to see that there's very little substance to any of this. Don't let the complex jargon and reference-heavy writing fool you, for it is merely a facade of intellectualism more than anything else. Once you're actually able to listen to what's being said, it becomes evidently clear that, in essence, it's basically a convoluted effort at defining the terminology through which any kind of debate takes place around specific issues, and using the position of power these people hold as academics to do so. In short, they're laying down the groundwork for a complex game of Mott and Bailey to be executed through words. Defining feminism as a movement to oppose all sexism ensures that any opposition to the ideology can only be classified as evil. Those on the ground, or trying to advocate for specific policies, can then point to these academics as holding authority to justify their own points of view. So it is not just in writing, but also in how they exercise their power they utilize circular logic. Why are feminist academics correct in what they say? It's because they're feminist academics, of course. Make no mistakes that what these people are saying is nothing special or unique in any way. Any amateur blogger could easily write on their level, or maybe even do a better job at it since most of it is not based on any form of research. Hell, there's literal random postmodern generators to be found on the internet. However, the most potent criticism of feminist theory, such as this, doesn't actually come from me, but it comes rather from Philosophy Tube's video in regards to Jordan Peterson's ideology. I am paraphrasing, but the main crux of the criticism is that Jordan Peterson, and those like him, are presenting their subjective opinions under the guise of Jungian structuralism to give it the appearance of objectivity. For example, instead of saying that a female politician is being too aggressive, for a woman, you can instead say that she's embodying the devouring mother archetype and presented under the guise of some form of objectivity. However, the irony is that the feminists such as Connell are doing the exact same thing, word for word. It's just that instead of using the devouring mother or the wise sage, they're using the social semiotics of gender or the phallus as the master signifier. In a sense, it is the exact same thing, just with more words and less comprehensible. If you have any thoughts on the review, make sure to comment and let me know your thoughts. Or better yet, you can join us on Discord to discuss ideas. The link will be in the comments.